The story of Christine Johnson is one of those cases that, at first glance, seems almost unimaginable. A mother, barely out of her own youth, raising an infant in the Mississippi Delta, surrounded by challenges that many in her community understood all too well. But what happened inside Christine's household during the mid-1990s shocked neighbors, friends, and later a courtroom, and would leave behind a disturbing precedent in the state's legal history. Christine Johnson was a young mother living in Greenville, Mississippi, when she gave birth to her son, Ceddrick, in 1993. At first, her family and friends described her as attentive, though inexperienced, as many young mothers are. She was balancing personal struggles, financial limitations, and a lack of steady support. But those who visited her in the early months often remarked that Ceddrick seemed like a typical, healthy baby. He was small but alert, with a soft laugh that Christine herself would later recall as the only thing that gave her a sense of stability. But the pressures of motherhood soon collided with a darker reality. Christine had a history of instability, marked by erratic behavior and what prosecutors would later describe as reckless tendencies that bordered on outright disregard for safety. Those closest to her noticed that she became increasingly careless with Ceddrick's care, sometimes leaving him alone for stretches of time, other times exposing him to unsafe conditions. Neighbors said they would hear the baby crying for hours, and though some chalked it up to the difficulties of a new mother adjusting, others felt something wasn't right. By the spring of 1994, the warnings of trouble became undeniable. Christine's parenting was sporadic and unpredictable. She was reported to have grown frustrated with Ceddrick's frequent crying spells, and rather than soothe him, she sometimes resorted to behavior that friends described as rough or indifferent. She would place him in his crib and leave the room for long periods, or hand him off abruptly to relatives without explanation. On several occasions, relatives noticed bruises and marks, though Christine would dismiss them as accidental falls or clumsy handling. Behind closed doors, however, Ceddrick's short life was unraveling into one of neglect and abuse. The infant's body bore signs of repeated mistreatment, though no formal investigation was launched at first. In the Mississippi of that era, social services were often underfunded and overburdened, and unless a direct report was made by medical staff or law enforcement, many cases of neglect slipped through the cracks. The tragedy struck on a day that should have been routine. Christine had been at home with Ceddrick when he suddenly stopped breathing. Panicked, she called for help, and emergency responders rushed to the scene. The 3-month-old boy was unresponsive, and despite their efforts to revive him, Ceddrick was pronounced dead. Christine's reaction was described by some as oddly flat, more confused than devastated. She cried, but there was a detached quality to her demeanor that struck investigators as unusual. At first, Ceddrick's death might have been classified as a sudden infant fatality, something tragically not uncommon among infants. But the autopsy told a different story. The medical examiner's report revealed injuries that were inconsistent with natural causes. Ceddrick had multiple bruises on his body, along with internal damage that could only be explained by blunt force or reckless handling. The examiner concluded that Ceddrick's death was the result of abuse, not accident. When investigators confronted Christine with these findings, her explanations shifted. She initially claimed that Ceddrick had rolled off the bed, but when pressed further, she admitted she may have handled him too roughly. Still, she stopped short of confessing to anything deliberate. Instead, she painted herself as overwhelmed, exhausted, and incapable of managing the constant demands of an infant. The case was handed over to the Washington County District Attorney's Office, and prosecutors soon decided to bring forward a rare and controversial charge: depraved-heart murder. In Mississippi law, this meant Christine had not intentionally set out to kill Ceddrick, but her actions had been so reckless, so devoid of regard for human life, that they were legally equivalent to murder. It was a statute used sparingly, typically in cases where someone's callous indifference created deadly circumstances, like firing a gun into a crowd or driving drunk at extreme speeds. But here, prosecutors argued that Christine's disregard for her baby's safety rose to the same level. The indictment stunned Christine's defense attorneys. They argued that while she may have been negligent and even culpable of manslaughter, branding her a murderer under the depraved-heart statute was extreme. The case began to attract local attention, with many residents divided. Some saw Christine as a troubled young woman who had failed her child, while others saw her as a monster who had snuffed out the life of a helpless infant. As the legal proceedings moved forward, more details about Christine's behavior emerged. Witnesses testified that they had seen her leave Ceddrick unattended, sometimes for hours, and that she often seemed more interested in her own social life than in his care. A relative recalled an incident in which Christine grew visibly irritated when Ceddrick cried during a family gathering, snapping that she couldn't take it anymore, before shoving him back into his stroller with unnecessary force. Another witness described Christine showing up at a party one evening without Ceddrick, only to admit later she had left him home alone. The defense countered these narratives by portraying Christine as a single mother trapped in poverty, struggling with the absence of reliable childcare and the crushing stress of isolation. They claimed the prosecution was painting her in the harshest light possible, ignoring her genuine affection for Ceddrick and her attempts, however flawed, to raise him. But the prosecution's case grew stronger with each piece of evidence. The medical examiner's testimony was damning. Ceddrick's injuries could not be explained by accidents. The bruises were in various stages of healing, suggesting a pattern of repeated harm. His internal injuries pointed to forceful handling, inconsistent with normal caregiving. The prosecution argued that Christine's behavior was not just negligent, it was criminally reckless, a complete disregard for the life of a baby who depended on her entirely. By the time the trial began in the mid-1990s, Christine Johnson had become a polarizing figure. The courtroom was filled with journalists, local residents, and family members of both Christine and Ceddrick. The prosecution described a household where an infant suffered in silence until his body could no longer endure the abuse. The defense painted a picture of a woman overwhelmed by circumstances, perhaps guilty of poor judgment, but not of murder. The turning point of part one of this story lies in the introduction of the depraved-heart murder charge. Rarely used in cases involving mothers and children, it set the stage for a courtroom battle that would not only determine Christine's fate, but also challenge the boundaries of Mississippi's criminal law. As Christine sat at the defendant's table, her face unreadable, Ceddrick's short life hung over the proceedings like a shadow. The jury would soon be asked to decide, was Christine Johnson a struggling young mother whose mistakes had fatal consequences? Or was she guilty of a reckless indifference so severe that it crossed the line into murder? The answer would come only after weeks of testimony, painful revelations, and an emotional debate over justice for a baby who never lived long enough to see his first birthday. The trial of Christine Johnson began under the gaze of a tense Greenville community. Courtroom benches were packed with local residents, journalists, and curious onlookers who wanted to see whether the state of Mississippi would succeed in pressing the rarely used charge of depraved-heart murder against a young mother. The stakes were enormous. If convicted, Christine could spend the rest of her life in prison. If acquitted, she might walk away with nothing more than the stigma of being the mother whose baby had died under suspicious circumstances. Christine herself looked distant as she sat at the defense table. Observers described her demeanor as unusual. Sometimes she appeared cold and detached, while at other times she burst into tears, burying her face in her hands. It left jurors unsure of who she really was, grieving mother or a reckless woman trying to mask her guilt. The prosecution wasted no time in setting the stage. District Attorney's Office attorneys stood before the jury and declared that Ceddrick's short life had ended not by chance, not by sudden illness, but by the reckless and cruel indifference of his own mother. They pointed to the autopsy results, which showed multiple bruises, internal bleeding, and evidence of repeated trauma. They reminded the jury that a 3-month-old baby cannot injure himself in such ways. Someone had inflicted that pain, and the only person with opportunity and access was Christine. To drive the point home, they called the medical examiner, who walked the jury through the autopsy step by step. With clinical precision, he described the bruises in different stages of healing, suggesting Ceddrick had been harmed more than once. He explained the internal injuries, bleeding near the brain and trauma to the chest, and concluded they were consistent with rough handling or blunt force. The courtroom grew silent as he held up diagrams of Ceddrick's tiny body, showing where the damage had been found. Several jurors averted their eyes. One woman dabbed her face with a tissue. The prosecution also presented witnesses from Christine's own family. Relatives testified that they had seen Christine snap at Ceddrick, shoving him back into his crib when his cries irritated her. One cousin described an incident at a family gathering when Christine muttered that she couldn't take it anymore, before roughly rocking Ceddrick back and forth until others intervened. Another relative admitted that Christine sometimes left the baby alone for hours, a shocking revelation that painted a picture of consistent neglect. Neighbors came forward too. One woman from Christine's apartment complex said she often heard the baby crying for long stretches, sometimes late into the night. She told the jury that the crying would eventually stop, but she could never be sure whether it was because Ceddrick had been comforted or because Christine had lost her patience. Another neighbor testified that Christine sometimes asked others to keep an eye on the baby while she stepped out, but then disappeared for hours at a time. The defense team fought back aggressively. They argued that Christine was not a monster, but a young, overwhelmed mother struggling under poverty, stress, and a lack of support. They pointed out that Mississippi had one of the highest infant mortality rates in the country at that time, and sudden, unexplained deaths were tragically common. They suggested Ceddrick's death could have been caused by sudden infant death syndrome, SIDS, and that the bruises could have come from accidental mishandling during frantic attempts to resuscitate him. Christine's attorney emphasized her age and isolation. Christine Johnson, he told the jury, was a young mother left to raise a newborn without resources, without help, and without understanding of what she was facing. Was she perfect? Was she negligent? Perhaps, but negligent is not murder. He accused the prosecution of stretching Mississippi law beyond reason, using the depraved-heart murder statute as a weapon to punish Christine simply because the community needed someone to blame. To bolster their case, the defense called Christine's friends to the stand. Some testified that Christine genuinely loved her son, that she was often seen cuddling and kissing him, and that she appeared devastated after his death. One friend described finding Christine collapsed on her couch after Ceddrick's passing, whispering over and over, "I don't know what I did wrong." Another insisted that Christine had no history of violence, and that any suggestion she deliberately harmed her child was cruel exaggeration. But the prosecution had anticipated these defenses. They brought back the medical examiner, who dismantled the SIDS theory. "Sudden infant death syndrome leaves no bruises," he said firmly. "It does not cause internal bleeding. It does not create injuries in multiple stages of healing. Ceddrick Johnson did not die from SIDS. He died from abuse." The jury listened as both sides clashed, but the testimony that cut deepest came not from doctors or lawyers, but from Ceddrick's grandmother. Taking the stand with trembling hands, she recalled the day Ceddrick was born, her joy at holding him, and the growing concern she felt as she watched Christine's frustration mount in the months that followed. At one point, she admitted she had thought of calling Child Protective Services, but hesitated, fearing it would cause permanent rifts in the family. Her voice cracked as she said, "I should have done more. Maybe he would still be here." That moment left the courtroom in tears, but it also carried weight against Christine. To jurors, it reinforced the idea that warnings had been ignored, and that Ceddrick's suffering had been visible even to those closest to him. Christine herself took the stand in her own defense. She spoke softly, insisting she had never meant to harm her son. She admitted to sometimes being overwhelmed, to raising her voice when Ceddrick cried endlessly, but denied ever deliberately injuring him. "I loved my baby," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't know why God took him from me." Under cross-examination, however, the prosecution pressed her about the bruises, the unattended hours, the neighbor's testimony. Christine struggled to answer, sometimes stammering, sometimes shaking her head, as if the details themselves were slipping from her memory. The trial stretched on for days, then weeks, each side painting conflicting portraits of the same woman. To the state, Christine Johnson was a reckless mother whose disregard for her child's safety rose to the level of murder. To the defense, she was a tragic figure, guilty of mistakes but not of the monstrous crime alleged against her. Finally, closing arguments arrived. The prosecution reminded the jury of the medical examiner's testimony and the repeated injuries Ceddrick suffered. This was not one mistake, the attorney thundered. This was a pattern of reckless indifference to the life of a child who could not protect himself. That is depraved heart murder. The defense countered with appeals to sympathy. Christine Johnson sits before you not as a criminal, but as a young mother who has already lost the most precious thing in her life. Do not compound that tragedy by branding her a murderer. If she is guilty, it is of being overwhelmed, of being human, not of murder. The jury was left to deliberate. Inside the jury room, the debate grew heated. Some jurors argued passionately that Christine's conduct fit the definition of depraved heart murder. Others hesitated, questioning whether she truly had the malicious disregard the law required. The discussion stretched into hours, then days. Greenville waited for the verdict with bated breath, aware that the outcome would not only decide Christine's fate, but also test the reach of Mississippi's criminal law. As Christine sat in the courtroom, staring straight ahead with red-rimmed eyes, the jury prepared to deliver their decision. The jury filed back into the courtroom after hours of tense deliberation. The air inside Greenville's courthouse was thick with anticipation. Christine sat at the defense table, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her knuckles pale from the pressure. Family members of both Christine and Ceddrick sat silently, some holding hands, others staring at the floor. The judge instructed everyone to remain quiet as the foreperson of the jury stood to deliver the verdict. When the words came, they hit like a thunderclap. Guilty of depraved heart murder. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Christine slumped forward, shaking her head in disbelief, whispering, "No, no, no," under her breath. Her attorney placed a hand on her shoulder, but she barely seemed to register it. Across the aisle, Ceddrick's relatives wept openly, clinging to each other as the weight of justice, or at least the semblance of it, finally descended. The judge thanked the jury for their service, but before dismissing them, he reminded them of the gravity of what they had decided. "You have found Christine Johnson guilty of the highest charge available under Mississippi law for this type of conduct," he said solemnly. "The consequences of that verdict are severe." And severe they were. Under Mississippi law, depraved heart murder carried the same potential sentence as intentional homicide: life in prison. The sentencing hearing was set for several weeks later, giving both sides time to prepare arguments on punishment. During that period, the community of Greenville was consumed with debate. Some believed justice had been served, that Ceddrick's short life had not been ignored, and that Christine's conviction sent a clear message. Children must be protected, even if that means holding parents fully accountable for reckless behavior. Others, however, felt the verdict was too harsh. Letters to local newspapers questioned whether Christine's conduct truly rose to the level of depraved indifference. Some argued that she should have faced charges of manslaughter or child neglect instead, but not murder. When the day of sentencing arrived, the courtroom once again filled to capacity. Christine appeared thinner, paler, and emotionally drained. She stood before the judge, trembling slightly as her attorney made a final plea for mercy. "Your Honor," he began, "Christine Johnson is not a hardened criminal. She is not a danger to society. She is a mother who made mistakes, tragic mistakes. But locking her away for life serves no purpose. It robs her of any chance at redemption and does not bring Ceddrick back." The defense urged the court to consider Christine's youth, her lack of prior criminal record, and the difficult circumstances under which she was raising her child. They asked for leniency, a reduced sentence, or at least the possibility of parole. The prosecution, however, stood firm. "This was not one mistake," the prosecutor reminded the judge. "This was a series of reckless choices, each one placing Ceddrick in greater danger, until finally it cost him his life. A child cannot defend himself. A child cannot escape. He relied on his mother to keep him safe, and she showed a callous disregard for that duty. This is exactly what the depraved heart murder statute was written for. Justice demands life." Before pronouncing the sentence, the judge gave Christine the chance to speak. She rose slowly, her eyes wet with tears, and addressed the court in a soft, quivering voice. "I never wanted to hurt my baby," she said. "I loved him. I don't know why this happened, but I swear I didn't mean for him to die. Please believe me." The silence that followed was unbearable. Finally, the judge spoke, his voice steady and resolute. "Christine Johnson, The jury of your peers has found you guilty of depraved heart murder. This court is bound by that verdict. While I recognize the tragedy of your circumstances, I cannot ignore the tragedy that befell your child. Therefore, it is the judgment of this court that you be sentenced to life imprisonment in the custody of the Mississippi Department of Corrections. Christine let out a strangled sob as deputies moved to escort her from the courtroom. Her mother cried out, "Please, she's still my baby," while Ceddrick's grandmother clasped her hands together, whispering a prayer under her breath. The room was divided between those who felt relief and those who felt only sorrow. In the months and years that followed, Christine's case continued to echo through Mississippi's legal and political landscape. Legal scholars debated whether the use of depraved heart murder was appropriate or whether Christine had been made into an example to satisfy public outrage over child abuse. Some argued that her conviction broadened the scope of the law in dangerous ways, allowing prosecutors to seek extreme punishments in cases that might otherwise have been classified as manslaughter or neglect. But others insisted the verdict was necessary. To them, Ceddrick's bruises, his internal injuries, and his repeated suffering were evidence enough that his death was not a simple accident. It was the result of consistent disregard, the very definition of depraved indifference. Christine's story also sparked broader conversations about motherhood, poverty, and the lack of social support systems for young parents in Mississippi. Advocates pointed out that Christine was just one of many young women struggling alone, without adequate access to counseling, parenting education, or financial resources. They argued that while accountability was important, prevention was even more critical, and that Ceddrick's death might have been avoided had there been stronger community safety nets. As for Christine herself, she disappeared into the prison system, her name rarely surfacing in the years that followed. In interviews conducted with other inmates, some described her as quiet and withdrawn, spending much of her time reading or writing letters she never seemed to send. Whether she ever fully accepted responsibility for Ceddrick's death remained unclear, but Ceddrick Johnson's short life left an indelible mark. His name became part of Mississippi legal history, cited in law schools and legal journals as a key case defining the scope of depraved heart murder. And for the community of Greenville, his memory lingered as a painful reminder of how quickly neglect can turn into tragedy. In the end, the Christine Johnson case was not just about one mother and her child. It was about the fragile line between mistaken crime, between negligence and murder. It was about how far society is willing to go in demanding accountability, even when the accused is not a stranger, but a parent. And it was about the haunting truth that sometimes the greatest danger a child faces comes not from the outside world,